Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to have you with us this afternoon as we get to explore the US-Mexico-Canada agreement and its first 2 years and moving into year 3. We happen to have an important announcement that happened today in this agreement that we'll get to talk about. But we're particularly honored to have with us to start off this seminar, Congressman Kevin Brady from the 8th Congressional District in Texas, and well and widely known as being one of the real champions of US trade policy, giving consistent attention to our trading relationships. It was key to working on the passage of USMCA, but also more than 10 or a dozen other trade agreements during his years of activity. We always very much appreciated when I was inside government that when Congressman Brady was on the case, you might get some tough questions, but you were going to get very well-informed questions and very thoughtful steps taking agreements forward or in implementing those agreements. So Congressman Brady, thank you very much for being with us, and we really appreciate hearing your thoughts about where we are 2 years into the implementation of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement.
Great. Well, thank you, Ambassador Wayne, for your leadership and that kind of introduction. Thank you, obviously, the Wilson Center for hosting today. Really is an honor to be here with panelists representing both Canada and Mexico. And this is a day to celebrate the second anniversary of the trade agreement that benefits our closest neighbors and trading partners, Mexico and Canada. Really honored to be on the panel with General Director Moy and Ambassador Blay, who do a terrific job in business and in approaches on trade. I think much of our economic strength comes from the fact we have a strong and a peaceful trading relationship with our neighbors. We share common goals. We seek to empower our nation's workers to compete on an even playing field, so the goods and services can flow from one nation to the next, really in a way that ensures a path to prosperity for all three countries. We've all seen the toll the pandemic has taken with closed factories, closed trade routes, and closed storefronts. Today, it's really been compounded by a struggling US economy, inflation globally, war in Europe, a prolonged supply chain crisis. It's really made it harder for our workers, families, businesses, and our economies overall to recover. Yet, here's USMCA, which has allowed trade to bounce back from its pre-COVID levels and averaging a 6% a year increase across the region. I think that benefits certainly American workers and businesses, but I think it benefits those same in Mexico and Canada as well. I don't think there's been a more important time to unleash and secure economic growth. Now, more than ever, we need to expand commerce throughout our continent so everyone can make up for lost time and not merely returning to the pre-COVID levels. Appropriately, as you know, members of Congress are increasingly focused on our competition with China. This threat to our security and economy is very real, really requires a comprehensive response, both from the private sector and government. In my view, our upgraded partnership with our neighbors, Mexico and Canada, is a vital component to making American workers and our businesses more competitive relative to China. When we bring our strengths together, we all compete better against China. And I think USMCA is crucial to the path toward a better future economically, but after COVID especially, because it was developed with the future in mind. It's rooted in important lessons from the past, that's true, but I think we understand that global trade works best when we shape and ensure our economies here at home. As you know, I sit in the seat that former President George H.W. Bush held on the Ways and Means Committee. And I noted when he joined leaders from Mexico and Canada to initiate the original NAFTA, he described the trade agreement as a turning point in the history of our three countries. How right he was, because 25 years later, our nations would find their way back to the negotiating table, working together to find ways to build on that foundation. So what do you call 25 years of free trade in North America? The answer is a good start. USMCA was the answer to meet the demands of the 21st century based on very hard bipartisan work. I think this agreement thoroughly rebuts the misguided view of some that free trade agreements are 20th century tools that should no longer be the focus of US trade policy. But in my view, it set a standard for trade agreements that brought together a region of fast-growing economies. We strengthened provisions such as zero tariffs on US goods exported to our neighbors. It opens new market, at least for the US, things that are important to us like US dairy, wine, and poultry. Cutting red tape for Main Street business owners to buy and sell throughout the North American marketplace. And as you know, the fewer the restrictions for legitimate trade, legal trade that gets in the way, the better. I know from America's viewpoint, USMCA leveled the playing field, helped us become more resilient. It brought good jobs back to America and increased paychecks for our workers. 2 years in, I think we're in a better position because of this agreement, both here in North America and in competition against aggressive countries like China. It allows us to compete with. I think too, Ambassador, to your point today, vital to that success has been ensuring it's fully implemented and fully enforced. Both parties, Democrats and Republicans, agree on that. And I think that was one of the keys in such a strong historic vote there. Implementation of every agreement has its ups and downs. We know that's how that works. But I think one of the USMCA's key upgrades was fixing NAFTA's broken dispute settlement system, allowing us to promptly address disputes without jeopardizing trade overall, really key there. I think on our side, U.S. Trade Representative Tai has had some successes in using USMCA's powerful new enforcement mechanism to address specifically labor issues in Mexico, and then with our Canadian neighbors on the problematic dairy policies. But my point to the Biden administration is they must ensure that all commitments be equally enforced. That's vital, especially if we want to build on this bipartisan support for future trade agreements. But how that's worked in practice is a challenge. Unfortunately, despite the new framework, to date at least, the Biden administration's trade agenda has been uneven in how it sought enforcement. And prior to today, really, the Biden White House initiated 5 labor disputes, 1 environmental dispute, but none on other issues that affect so many American farmers, workers, businesses, and investors. And while it is important to enforce labor environmental rules to prevent any race to the bottom, enforcement should be full and it should be balanced. We need to go beyond labor environment, include a focus on the very troubling issues U.S. companies tell us they face in both the energy and the ag sector. And that is, Ambassador, why I am so encouraged by the request for consultations that the U.S. filed today. They really address a wide range of ways in which we believe government Mexico has been walking away from its obligations in the energy sector. This harms our businesses and North American competitiveness, and I think it hurts Mexico's own consumers and its efforts in the environmental area. This action may be overdue, but it is very welcome, and I commend Ambassador Tai for her leadership in raising these issues consistently with their counterpart in Mexico over the last 2 years, and now pursuing these legal claims to show Mexico, the United States is serious about full enforcement, won't look the other way if it continues to ignore its USMCA commitments. And so I'm hopeful that our friends in Mexico will respond in the right way, reverse its problematic policies in the energy sector. And again, I'm glad we have a dispute process that can ensure prompt resolution. I also think we should be continuing engagement on addressing Mexico's policies dealing with our American farmers, especially on science and prompt approvals of biotech. I'll make this sort of the final point here. American leadership is about more than even enforcement. I think it's about setting the stage for creating new ones. America needs to lead on trade in so many areas. And I think on that front, we're missing opportunities because the U.S. Isn't leading and sometimes isn't even on the playing field. Amidst this supply chain crisis, raging inflation, war of Europe, a shrinking economy, we should seek new free trade agreements wherever possible to find new customers, to get our economy moving again. It's no secret I've been critical because I fear we've had the opposite. I worry the administration has chosen to put a moratorium on new free trade agreements and new customers. That over time worsens inflations, I think prevents the healing of the economies and our supply chains through higher standards and greater cooperation. I think really because the historic momentum and vote in USMCA, I saw and still see a lot of opportunity for bipartisan support here with this president. I think the White House would find in Congress eager partners in resuming our leadership. I think every president deserves the ability to trade promotion authority to consult with Congress and negotiate new customer opening trade agreements on our behalf. And we could even start with the things on which we've long agreed, the passage of general services preferences and the miscellaneous tariffs bill. So bottom line is I think we all understand the benefit of new strategic trade agreements that strengthen the supply chains, open new customers, just like USMCA has done. And I think as we celebrate this important anniversary and future anniversaries for this historic agreement, USMCA should serve as a foundation for future trade agreements and continue a long history of bipartisan support for U.S. leadership on the international stage. The future is bright under this new agreement. 2 years is an important milestone to celebrate. Thank you, Wilson Center, for leading this. I'm looking forward to so many more and to celebrating them together as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman. I very much appreciate not only your strong endorsement of USMCA, but your indication that you think there is bipartisan support for exploring other areas where we can make progress in new trade arrangements, other kind of economic liberalization moves going forward. I think that is vital. Your support has been just essential in getting us to where we are right now. You were a key element of the bipartisan support that got USMCA in place to begin with, as well as a number of other important trade agreements. And I hope that you will be part of that coalition as we move forward to new opportunities. So thank you very much for being with us, despite the shift around in votes that you have today.
No, Ambassador, it always works that way. The thing you're looking most to forward for the whole week, they call votes. So with your permission, I'm going to have to scoot off. And I know you've got great panelists there and we'll be following the discussion. But again, thank you so much for your leadership in the Wilson Center's just key roles.
Thank you very much. It was great to have you start us off.
Thank you, sir.
Good care.
Thank you.
So now we're going to hear from a very strong panel of perspectives from Canada, Mexico, and the United States to take us forward and to begin exploring the issues of USMCA. We have Ann McKinney, the Vice President for the Americas Program at the U.S. Chamber, and she's also the Executive Vice President of the Association of American Chambers of Commerce in Latin America and the Caribbean, and now oversees the America's programs that promote trade and investment for the U.S. Chamber. Before, she has a long career working for various parts of the U.S. government, very constructively in these same areas. So we're really happy to have Ann with us. Thank you for being with us. We have Louise Blais, who is joining us representing the Canadian counterpart, in a sense, of the U.S. Chamber. And Louise was an ambassador of Canada and a Canadian diplomat. Until 2021, she was Canada's ambassador and deputy permanent representative at the United Nations. She has served abroad in other countries and has also served in Atlanta as Consul General of Canada. So she knows the United States very well. And she had several jobs at Global Affairs Canada, including being in charge of the public diplomacy, I noted, which is a very important part of diplomatic activity. So we're very much looking forward to hearing her perspectives, adding that perspective of the Canadian private sector to this conversation. And finally, we're very honored to have Valeria Moy with us. Valeria is the Director General of IMCO, the Instituto Mexicano para la Competitividad. I always get the two TTs in there for competitividad.
It always happens.
It does. And that's a very influential think tank in Mexico City that looks at economic and social phenomena related to Mexico's competitiveness. And they put out a number of very thought-provoking and analyses and reports looking at some of the challenges that Mexico is facing. And she's previously been director of Mexico Como Vamos. She teaches and does research at a number of other Mexican institutions and universities. She has worked in the regulatory sector in Mexico. She has done research and studies in the United States as well as elsewhere, and she's a regular columnist in Mexico on these issues also. So we're very much looking forward to hearing from each of you. And first, I thought I'll ask a couple of questions and maybe have each of you offer some thoughts about that. And the first question is really, where do you we just celebrated the second anniversary of USMCA and its implementation. Now we have a special event that just happened in that the United States just asked for consultations on the practices of the Mexican government vis-a-vis the energy sector. But up until now, if you look at these first 2 years, what do you think are maybe 3 areas where USMCA has gone well, and 3 areas where you think it hasn't performed quite as at quite the level that we would hoped during the first 2 years? So maybe I'll start with our Canadian colleague, Luis, if you'd like to start off, and then maybe Valeria, and then I'll let Anne wrap up the sort of thoughts about this.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Ambassador. From now on, I guess I'll call you Tony. But
Tony is fine.
I'm just so happy to be here, and what a great panel. And I cannot help but note that it's wonderful to be here with 2 other women and be answering your questions, Tony. And perhaps I will say that what has really worked well, and we're seeing it today with this consultation requirement, there have been quite a few disputes that have been settled. Some more quietly than others. Some just didn't get to the level of today, but using the framework of the agreement has led to those resolutions. I'm thinking, for example, of the recent announcement of solar panel that the Minister Ng put forward to that was resolved fairly well. We've had some labor complaint disputes that have gone in the favor of the complainants in Mexico, and so the standards, we have reasons to believe that labor standards are being improved through the agreement. But it's also been 2 years of pandemic and enormous supply chain disruption, and despite that, we have seen tremendous growth in our trade since COVID. 40 to 45%, depending on the data that you look at. So you can say that on an actual number, if USMCA or CUSMA, as we like to call it in Canada, if it's not responsible for that growth, it certainly did not stand in the way of it. So and I would like to say that it has provided that intangible, that thing that's not always possible to quantify, is predictability. It's made it easier for investment flows to come in from Europe and Asia into all 3 of our countries have benefited greatly over the past year or so with announcements, never ending announcements of new plants here and there, because they now have this, they know that with this agreement, we have a predictable trade environment. So I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to hearing fellow panelists' views.
Thank you, Luis. Valeria.
Well, just a brief comment here. Thank you, Ambassador. Well, I think I definitely agree with what Luis was mentioning. For Mexico, last year was very important regarding growth. We didn't rebound to the previous levels of GDP that we have. We decreased in 2020 8.5%, and we only grew during 2021 5%. Basically, part of that growth, an important part of that growth, was due to trade. And when we see consumption levels, investment levels, basically the only level that has come to the levels that we had before the pandemic are the ones related to trade, imports and exports. So despite the trade disruptions, despite all these interruptions in the production chains, trade has become increasingly important for Mexico. So that's the good news. What do I think? It has fallen a little bit behind of the expectations that we had. Basically, the SMEs, small and medium enterprises chapter, I think that it hasn't gone to any place. We had a lot of hope in that regard. And I mean, really, when I mention it's hope, because the market by itself won't do anything to help these SMEs. So we have to do something else. And the Ministry of Economy in Mexico is not doing anything on that regard. And we need to do something. We have to kind of make a notch in order for the small and medium-sized enterprises in Mexico, which account for 94% of all the firms in Mexico, can benefit of the things that are included in the USMCA. And we have a maybe different perspective from the labor issue, for the labor issue. In our regard, I think the labor reforms that we did in Mexico are okay. They're good for the workers. They will be very well implemented, but in time. And I think it's not a very symmetrical relationship, but that's the way it was implemented. That's the way it was written. So we have to abide by it. I mean, regardless of what I think, we have to abide by it, whether I like them or not. And of course, the energy issue, I think, is one of the major issues, not only for the treaty itself, for the USMCA itself, but also for Mexico and the path that Mexico is taking towards greener or not taking towards greener energies in our country.
Thank you very much. All really important issues, and we can come back to them a little bit, but Anne, please add some of your thoughts.
Thank you, Ambassador Wayne, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the Wilson Center's Mexico and Canada Institutes for this invitation, and I'm delighted to be on this panel with Luis and Valeria, and certainly would like to take the opportunity, although he had to leave for a vote, to really acknowledge and thank Representative Brady for his leadership on the House Ways and Means Committee on USMCA, which is an important bipartisan agreement, and certainly appreciated his comments regarding a robust trade policy, and encouraged by his view that there's bipartisan support for a more robust policy. In terms of the USMCA, I think it's helpful to look at North American integration as a long journey, starting with the US-Canada Auto Pact in 1965, the US-Canada FTA, NAFTA, and now USMCA. And in terms of results, we really see that USMCA is delivering tangible benefits to all three countries, and is a very important tool for competitiveness and the shared well-being of North America as a region. And so first and foremost, I certainly agree with Luis and Valeria. One of the important aspects of USMCA is that it helped restore certainty in the North American trade and investment relationship after a period of uncertainty, which gave businesses confidence to make longer term decisions. It preserved and modernized really key aspects of the North American trading relationship, and contains, best-in-class provisions in areas like e-commerce and digital economy, which are already helping to expand regional trade and can be replicated in other agreements as we look forward. From the standpoint of the United States, Canada and Mexico are our top two trading partners. Last year, our total trade with both countries combined represented around $1.3 trillion, about 28% of total US trade, and supporting 12 million jobs. So that, those are all very important aspects of the relationship. The agreement itself is a tool to help us achieve our objectives. So to succeed, we really believe that it's critical that all parties respect and enforce the agreement. So this is something that the business community has been very much focused on in terms of the full implementation and enforcement of USMCA. At the Chamber, we like to say that we're an equal opportunity critic in terms of identifying bad policies, regardless of their origin. And so we've identified opportunities for all three governments in terms of areas to focus on. In the US, we've called on the government to prioritize strict interpretation of the USMCA text on automotive rules of origin and efforts to ease compliance burdens. We've also expressed concerns about discriminatory Buy America rules that have been proposed in terms of electric vehicle components. In Canada, there's a continued call for meeting commitments related to the allocation of the dairy rate quotas, and also following issues like the digital services tax. In Mexico, of course, there's, in addition to energy policy compliance issues that the business community has been, tracking related to the Carta Porte requirements and Chapter 7 implementation for customs administration and trade facilitation, the pace of approval for biopharmaceuticals, medical devices, agricultural biotech, and food products. And then, of course, in the context of broader competitiveness, as already mentioned, one area that the business community has been really focused on is the direction of Mexico's energy policy. So the Chamber applauded USTR's announcement today that it's going to initiate dispute settlement consultations with Mexico on Mexico's energy policy. That's something that the business community has used various opportunities to raise with the governments in terms of the importance, as mentioned, not just for USMCA compliance, but also for the competitiveness of Mexico's economy and electric sector ability to meet its climate commitments. And these are things that companies are looking for and are concerned about in terms of investor confidence. So it's really important, we believe, that this decision today is a step forward to address these issues. So I'll leave it there.
I wanted to also say that we have Chris Sands, the director of the Canada Institute at the Wilson Center, with us. Really happy to have him with us here today. And so you've all stressed the importance of the certainty that's been returned since USMCA is there. And that's the importance of compliance, the importance of making sure that people abide by different commitments that they've made in this process. And I think importantly, Valeria added the role of SMEs. And all three governments have made a big point that they want this to be a more inclusive trading relationship that we're building across North America. We're going to include more people, more parts of the population than we did before. But that's hard to do. That's not easy, right? It's one thing to say we're going to be more inclusive and we're going to include communities that weren't included or were underserved before, but making that happen is different. It's like workforce development. We can all agree, yes, it's great to train workers. Getting programs that actually give them the skills they need is a harder thing to do. So there's part of this that's going to be hard and it's going to take time to do. But there are some other parts that we can be working on all along the way. And so what I'd like to ask each of you now to talk a little bit about is, what do you think should be the priorities for the months ahead? Not the years ahead. We'll come back to that in a minute, but just as you look at what you'd like to see the governments try to fix, try to improve, try to get going in these next months, what are things that you would point out? Louise, please.
Well, I think that's a very important question, and it's a hard one at the same time. I would say that if from the business community, one of the things that we're looking at, we talked about the predictability of USMCA, CUSMA, but that's just one instrument. It's a trade instrument. It has the right, it sends the right message, but what we need is a full suite of policy and initiatives and incentives that really foster our competitiveness. And what I think should be the priority is not just in the implementation of the USMCA, but at the same time to talk about what complementarity in terms of policy should we have that will actually bring SMEs, women-owned, women-led companies to the table, nearshoring issues in terms of our competitiveness against China. And it would be really wonderful if now that this agreement has been settled, it's been implemented, it's 2 years old, that we think about how we interconnect it with Latin America, with our hemisphere, and to see how we could really build a more resilient economy closer to home so that we could withstand those shocks that we're seeing in Europe, unfortunately, and of course, those that are coming from countries like China. So I have full confidence that USMCA will continue to be implemented properly, and NAFTA was, by and large. Now what really we need to step up. We need to just take what this deal has done. This is a tough part, negotiating this trade agreement, and really integrate our economy so that we become much more competitive internationally, and that we become more resilient as a region when it comes to critical sourcing of whether it goes from critical minerals to semiconductors, to agricultural goods, to health services and equipment. I think the pandemic and those disruptions that we've been living under over the past 2 years, I hope I've taught us all that we really need to integrate further, and we make our region more competitive internationally using USMCA as the sort of the banner under which we've done it, but not necessarily the one thing that's going to do it all. I think we now need to build other instruments that go along with this agreement to foster growth in our own hemisphere.
Thank you very much, Louise, for reminding us of that. And of course, we have the US-Canada roadmap process that goes on. We have the high-level economic dialogue with Mexico, which does some of these things. And then we have the North American Leaders Summit, and they've agreed they're going to meet again at the end of the year in Mexico. And there's an action agenda there. So I think there's a recognition that there are other things than just trade that need to be done. And even I just add in USMCA, the 3 trade ministers just agreed to create a new emergency action subcommittee when things disrupt trade across the border, because what we've seen over the last year is a number of different things on both borders have disrupted that trade, and there was not really a good response mechanism. And there does need to be that emergency management aspect to doing this. So there are a lot of things that we can do. That's very important. Valeria, please.
Well, regarding this idea that a trade agreement can solve everything, it's very weird that we actually, I'm going to talk for Mexico only, but that when Mexico believed that in 1994, that just by signing a very important trade agreement, we would solve all the issues that Mexico has: poverty, inequality, different growth in different regions of the country. Of course, that was not going to happen. And of course, it didn't happen. And now one of my fears is that we're giving exactly the same expectations for the USMCA, and that won't happen. Progress won't come to the south of the country just by signing a trade agreement. We need to do much more. And regarding, Tony, your specific question about the priorities that we need to focus on the months ahead, I think we need to focus, at least from the part of Mexico, in the rules of origin. We need to understand what's going to happen finally. Apparently, we will have a decision in September, but it's a very important decision for Mexico for the car industry, for the automotive industry. It's an incredibly relevant decision what's going to happen in September. Of course, we need to start talking seriously about the sunset clause, because we always discuss the sunset clause as something that is going to happen in the very long future, and it's going to be here very, very soon, and it will happen exactly the same that happened with under President Trump, that we, the ones that advocate for free trade, didn't have the numbers or didn't have the data to support that those ideas about trade. So we need to start working, and I think the best idea is to work together in order to prepare ourselves, the three countries, for what's going to happen in the sunset clause when the moment comes. And of course, I think one of the most relevant issues, and forgive me for saying this once more, is the energy sector. We are very worried in Mexico of what's going on within the energy sector, the energy market, the destruction of value that we are seeing, and the steps backwards that we're taking towards the environment. So I think we in Mexico would need the help of the US and of Canada in order to try to move forward instead of moving backwards in this regard.
Let me add, if anybody would like to pose any questions, you can send them either via Twitter to @Mexico-Institute or via email to mexico@wilsoncenter.org. So we'd like to hear your questions so we can try to answer them. Anne, please, your thoughts.
Thank you. I think one of the things that is clear is USMCA is an important tool, but it's not the only one. And I think critical for success is continued dialogue between the three governments, between the private sector and governments. And so while there's challenges, there's also an opportunity for business and government to work together to help create a stronger North American partnership and bolster the resilience of our supply chains. That's something that we set out to do just last week at our 12th US-Mexico CEO dialogue. We held a productive series of conversations with both governments on critical issues that affect North America as a whole. You mentioned the upcoming high-level US-Mexico high-level economic dialogue, the North American, which the next meeting will be held in Mexico in September. There's plans for a North American Leaders Summit. There's the US-Canada roadmap. So there's a lot of tools that exist for fostering this dialogue. A lot of important technical conversations and consultations have been ongoing, as already mentioned, through using these channels. And one near-term opportunity and priority that we see is really on maintaining the trade flows during emergency situations. I think we learned the lesson from COVID and really, call on the three governments to capitalize on those lessons learned to align the definition of essential services across all three countries and improve emergency coordination. So Tony, as you mentioned, we were encouraged by the announcement that came out of the second USMCA Trade Commission meeting, where the ministers directed the Competitiveness Committee to create a subcommittee to cooperate during emergency situations. And again, there's an opportunity to focus on this work in these other mechanisms as well, like the HLED and Canadian US cooperation on critical infrastructure. So that's something near term that can make an important impact.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good point, Anne. We sort of learned the lessons. Whether we really learned and are going to apply the lessons is the challenge right now before governments. And so that's why this was encouraging. And then we've talked a lot about building resilient supply chains. In fact, I think there was a ministerial meeting that was just going on talking about that. But again, we have to turn that into practical reality. And so those are some of the important things. And that, as Valeria mentioned, there is a sunset clause in USMCA. That's very different. What that means is this agreement, there'll be a discussion in year 6 as to whether or not USMCA should continue, or if somebody wants to pull out, they could indicate that they would like to They won't leave right away, but they could state their objections. But what's going to happen is that in year 5, there will be a review and there'll be a discussion of what's been going well, what's not well, what might need to be changed. So what do each of you think should be some of the criteria that we start identifying now and thinking about that should be used to judge whether or not USMCA is being successful? And as you all have already indicated, USMCA is a little bit different than traditional trade agreements in the sense that, yes, the amount of trade is important, the amount of investment is important, but it lays out some other objectives also, including the labor area, including this whole area of inclusiveness. So it'd be very interesting to hear your thoughts about the sort of the clustering of things we should think about to make a judgment on how well this is working as we get into that 5th year review. Louise?
For this one, I was kind of hoping I wouldn't start off and I would be able to play off of my fellow panels.
Well, we can switch around. We can do a different.
Why don't we? Why don't we?
Okay. Well, Valeria, and then Anne, and then Louise. There we go.
Okay, let me take a hit on this. I don't know.
I think Valeria has some ideas on this.
No, I mean, of course, there will be specific issues, no specific areas, specific industries, specific points that will be discussed. And I think that's very important for the 3 economies. But I think there are broader issues that we have to talk about. First of all, jobs, job creation and job destruction. We have to bear in mind, of course, that any trade agreement comes without costs. There are always costs. Basically, in every decision you make, there are costs involved. So I think we have to consider those as well. So we have to consider the net job creation that we had in the 3 economies. And there's another thing that's very complicated to do. It's very complicated to analyze, but I think it's the most important thing for consumers and for people. And that is the options that the consumer have and the prices that the consumer faces. When we talk about the benefits of trade, we always mention options, we always mention pricing. But at the end, when we try to measure the impact of prices from free trade, we get completely lost in the discussion. We can't evaluate how would an apple would cost if with trade or without trade. We need to focus on that because that's the main issue for consumers. We don't realize as consumers that the benefits of trade are spread throughout the economy. The costs are very visible. The costs are very tangible. We can always see the people that were laid out or laid off in a firm that closed or in a factory that closed. But the prices are not evenly, but very much distributed along many goods and services throughout the whole economies. So we have to picture this and we have to convey this as a benefit of trade. And I realize it's incredibly difficult to do this. It's incredibly difficult because we need to analyze prices and we need to convey this to the general public. We need to make the general public understand the benefit of trade in a way that it's close to people, in a way that people can understand. And the basic thing that we all understand is prices. So I think it's one of the topics that we should discuss. And I think we won't do it because it's very complicated to do.
That's an excellent point. And I remember giving a number of different speeches to students and other people around the United States trying to explain that to people. It's hard to do. So it's a very good point. Anne, please.
Well, I think I'd like to go back to, one of the main benefits of USMCA that we discussed at the outset, and that's certainty. By clearly spelling out the rules of the road, USMCA has been an important tool to enhance North America's competitiveness as a region and to generate prosperity for our countries. So I think, instead of focusing on questioning the benefits of, an agreement that has had strong multipartisan, bipartisan in the US, multipartisan regionally support that the governments and stakeholders should really quickly agree to the extension and use the review period to evaluate and address any implementation and compliance issues. One concern that is that a prolonged debate about the agreement's merits will once again create this uncertainty, affect investment and even, exporters in all three countries' abilities to make those sorts of long-term decisions that has, helped make, that has been so important with using USMCA as this important tool to grow our three economies.
Yeah, that's been one of the trade-offs all along, is the assurance that encourages people to make investments versus the debates over the particular policy issues, that they often clash with each other. Luis, any thoughts?
Well, definitely, it's a double-edged sword. This sunset clause, no doubt about it. It's a short term, to be honest, six years, and there's been debate as to whether it would be a check the box exercise and we roll over, which in a way would be that certainty continuing, and so it wouldn't be the end of the world. Or will it be used as an opportunity to improve, tweak, address issues without having this general big political debate as to whether we should have one or not? For the business community, as Anne said, it would be very important that discussion not put the idea of a deal in jeopardy, but it would be about improving it, changing it, moving it forward. And there'll be probably elections in all three countries, most likely, between now and that moment, which is around the corner, really. But so you have all of these political cycles. We might have faced a recession, unfortunately. We don't know, but we're certainly facing inflation. There are all sorts of things in the economy that are not going very well. Nothing to do with USMCA. These pressures are coming from way beyond. But the danger will always be that politically it could become a punching bag, the way NAFTA did. And that is the worry of that clause. So it will be very much, I think, up to us who believe in the importance of this agreement, the business community, and others that are allies, to prepare the field so that we have a healthy debate at year 6, but not one that really destabilizes everything all over again. I think that's that wouldn't be very helpful. So how we do that, I think events like today, I think is one way. Continuing the conversation, making sure that the public is well informed, proper data collecting, like Valeria mentioned. I think we really do need to develop the kinds of metrics that I'll say, because right now we could say there this many jobs, this level of investment, wages have increased, prices have gone down. Those data points or you can establish them. What's more difficult to do is to establish the direct correlation between USMCA and those data points. And so I think we need to start to work with those economists and those brilliant people out there to really and communicate those direct linkages between the improved data points. And so that we're equipped with the right talking points, and we've done the education ahead of what, you'll forgive me if I'm a little pessimistic, but I was Consul General when NAFTA was almost torn apart. And we came, the world doesn't know quite how close we came from that happening. Really, it was very close. And so the sunset clause I think was one of the requirements. It was a modern thing to do, but on the other hand, I'm not it properly so that it doesn't bring us back to that brinkmanship the way that we had in the past, because it can be too tempting sometimes for certain politicians to use it as a tool for domestic support and also negotiating with other countries. So sorry to be blunt, but so my hope is that we look at the data, that we prepare the public, and that it's not a question of whether we're going to go forward with the USMCA, is how we go forward. What do we need to improve and tweak? And that would be my hope on behalf of the business community in Canada. I think I could say that pretty safely.
So building on those excellent points and speaking from my background in diplomacy, and Louise, your background also, what we would then think about doing is having a public diplomacy campaign, right? Organizing across maybe the three governments to collect some of this data and just share it with the public and have more spokesmen out talking about it. If we look at the capacity of the governments across North America right now, they're very strained by what they have to do just as part of their day-to-day implementation of this. It's not evident there's a public diplomacy or public outreach, public education effort on the part of governments going forward. What suggestions or ideas do you have any to offer as to how we could get better at this as we approach this review period? Should the governments try to have a more concerted public education effort? Should there be, conferences held to help define what Valeria was talking about, where the private sector and think tanks and others get together and come up with some of these things? Is there a way we could help strengthen the ability of the public to understand what's going on in this very complex but very important relationship? And any of you have any thoughts on that? It's a big challenge.
It's a complicated question, Tony. I don't think the government should, I don't think it's the role of the government to have a communication strategy regarding the benefits or the costs of trade. I think it relies more upon the firms. I think the business sector should be more keen on giving the public some idea of the goods and services that they have benefiting from trade. But it's a weird question, and I am not sure of my own answer. It's like I don't think governments should take this role, but we need to convey and we need to transmit to the general public the benefits of trade agreements. And I don't know exactly how to do that. But Louise is raising her hands. She might know.
Valeria, you just reminded me, and that's why, if I may, Tony, just jump back in here. I remembered when I was advocating for at the time, maintaining NAFTA, against the backdrop of it potentially being torn up, as I think was the expression. I visited many plants and heavy manufacturing in the Southeast United States, and a place that was politically leaning towards the narrative that was being carried forward at the time, so therefore tearing up NAFTA. And I would go and speak to other plant managers, and I would express my fear that I was working to advocate against this, and of course the plant managers and the CEOs of these companies all understood how greatly they benefited from NAFTA and how essential it was to the survival of their organization, their installation where they were. But they always said that they were reluctant to speak to this effect to their employees, because I would basically say, I'm expecting that probably if I were to poll employees right now in this plant, I probably would find 60-70% that have a negative view of NAFTA, that they remember their parents' textile mills being closed down, whatever the impression is, they were negative towards it. But I said they potentially voted against their best interest. And as a company manager, but it's like church and state. The companies within themselves don't deal with these political issues with their employees. They themselves don't talk to them about the impact of some of that rhetoric and narrative at the national level can impact on their own jobs. And so perhaps when you're asking for suggestion, I'll take that back to my own community now, the private sector, to say maybe companies need to do a better job, at very least, to make sure that their companies, their suppliers are very well informed that the reason why they're having some of these advantages comes from these trade agreements. They're just, and that's just one of the ideas, in addition to the ones you've mentioned, Tony, about the public diplomacy, the data points. But I think it has to be, we have to be able to talk about it in communities, small town America, small town Canada. And some of the best messengers in that are the employers, or the people offering the jobs. I have to say, this job, I'm able to offer it to you because of liberalized trade and agreements like USMCA. So I'll take that back to the Business Council to see how far I get in my own organization. But that would be an idea, and I think it's that I would suggest.
Thank you. I don't know, Anne, do you want to offer a thought, and then we'll turn to Chris and let him offer some final remarks?
Sure, I do. I would like to offer a few thoughts, and I think it's very much relevant, the question of what government and stakeholders should do. It relates to the last question in terms of the sunset clause, the future of the agreement, and seeing USMCA as a tool and how it's being used and implemented. So, as we learned just a few years ago, it's easy to take the North American trading relationship for granted. And although the economic benefits were widespread, they weren't always obvious to the average observer. And so I think it's actually important for all of us. It is important for government to play a role to explain the benefits of the policies that they're advocating, and as well as the private sector. So, during the whole process of securing of the negotiations of USMCA and securing approval, the Chamber led the USMCA coalition, working with member companies, a broad, huge range of local and state chambers, other business and industry associations, to advocate for the agreement, demonstrate the support, and really took action, at the local level. I think we also saw a number of interesting examples where companies have actually, to their employees, highlighted, the linkage between their jobs, the products that they're producing, and where those products go in terms of the huge demand that's being driven, by export potential. So I think we need data. We need all, it requires an effort by government and business, other stakeholders, organizations like the Wilson Center and many others to collect data, provide a forum for analysis and discussion, get out in communities, and really talk about the benefits. We focus very much on what does a job mean to a family, to a community, and to our country. So I think looking at how we convey data in a way that's easily understood and relatable to the citizens of our three countries, as well as to elected officials, is very important, and as a constant effort. So again, thank you and congratulations for providing this space to do this on a regular basis, and not just when we have an anniversary like the 2-year anniversary of USMCA implementation.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Valerian. Thank you, Louise. There's clearly a lot we could still be discussing here, and that we do need to discuss as we go forward. So thanks for being with us. And Valeria, I know you have to go off to another meeting, but let me ask Chris, please, to share some thoughts.
Sure. Thank you very much, Tony. And I couldn't be more pleased with this panel. It is inspiring that the future of USMCA is in such good hands with Louise and Anne and Valeria. And, I think Representative Brady also gave us a lot to think about here today. What I take away from this discussion is an important thought, and all of you have touched on it, which is that the USMCA acts as a kind of shock absorber. Many of the shocks that we're facing in North America come from outside our region, whether it's the pandemic or spike in oil prices or supply chain tightening. But here in the USMCA region, we've had a shock absorber that has kept our trade going and in many ways helped us to not suffer an economic downturn that could have been much worse had we been fighting amongst ourselves. So there's a real positive benefit that we've seen from USMCA. Not only that, Representative Brady talked about growing support for giving the Biden administration trade promotion authority, for having more trade agreements. And I think that is a remarkable turnaround. And for those of you who are watching this, who are in Washington, I'd call your attention to something that has been a surprising factor for me. In the 22 midterm elections, the 2022 midterm election campaigns, we've seen primaries and we're heading towards that final race. We have not seen the USMCA as a factor in the election. No one's campaigning against it. Now, I remember after NAFTA was negotiated from 1992 all the way through the election in 2020, each time the US had presidential candidate, someone in the mix who was anti-NAFTA, whether it was Ross Perot or Ralph Nader or eventually Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And so we've been in this world of NAFTA criticism in the United States. So it's striking now not to see this as a political football for the first time in quite a long time. Now, we talked about disputes at the outset of this discussion, disputes over Mexican energy. We've had disputes over softwood lumber, of course, too. And there are lots of things that we're arguing with. But the important thing about those disputes is how we're handling them. Disputes are not themselves a sign the trade agreement isn't working. If we can resolve disputes, if we can follow a rule of law in sorting out our different policies through using dispute mechanisms by talking to each other and not just fulminating at each other, I think that's also an important step towards the future of this agreement. People will give the USMCA a kind of performance legitimacy if it does indeed help us keep trading and solve the problems that we have, not to be discounted lightly. Now, something else that I find to be a factor now, and we've also touched on it here, but it's part of the Wilson Center's wider work. We have become so much more aware of supply chains in just the last couple of years, obviously because of supply chain shocks and shortages, whether it's PPE or vaccines for the pandemic. But by becoming more aware of supply chains, I think average Americans, Canadians, and Mexicans are becoming much more aware of how we build things together. That's something people in the trade community have known for a long time. It's something that's much more obvious for our citizens. And I think that too has shown them the importance of good trade relationships with our neighbors. We are in a period of reshoring or nearshoring or ally shoring a lot of supply chains because of uncertainty around China, uncertainty in the Middle East and Eurasia, uncertainty because of Russia's attack on Ukraine. Many businesses, and we hear this, I'm sure you hear this from your members, but we've heard it anecdotally over the last year. Many businesses are adopting a policy of putting North America first in their supply chain alignment, how to create regional supply chains that are more dependable, that will deliver, and that help you keep your costs down and competitive. And I think that vote of confidence in USMCA is also really important, seeing our businesses take that step forward. Now, it's not normal still. We are still in the middle of a pandemic. And one thing we did not talk about today, but that I want to insert into the discussion going forward, is that our pandemic-inspired border restrictions remain. Now, travel is this first step towards investment, and it supports future growth and trade. We've been cut off from each other to a shocking degree. It's nice to see you all on Zoom. It would be so much better to see you here in the flesh. And I think that goes to what we still have to work on. Despite our inability to work together face to face so often now, we are still going strong on our trade. But we're going to look forward, I hope, between now and 2026 to the removal of many of those travel restrictions so that we can get back to seeing each other again and hopefully be beyond the pandemic. Which leads me to the last point. Ambassador Wayne, I think you were astute to put an emphasis on 2026, the review of the NAFTA, not a review to a kill, that'll come 10 years later, but the see if we can update our agreement. And for me, the takeaway I have from that is not only the optimism that the panel has put forward, but also that we have 3 important tests that will take place before we get there. We'll see a Mexican federal election in 2024. We'll see the US presidential election in 2024. And likely we'll see a Canadian parliamentary election in 2025, possibly sooner. You never know with the parliamentary system, but probably 2025. So the people sitting around the table in 2026 are uncertain. We don't know who they will be. But the fact that USMCA has become much less political and much more economic and successful, I think, is a very positive sign. And so I'm going to be watching future elections. I'm going to be looking for what business does, but I'm also optimistic, especially after this discussion, that 2026 could be a very important watershed in advancing USMCA and maybe even making it better. Over to you, Ambassador Wayne.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thanks again to everybody for joining us. Let me make a pitch for a series of essays that we have on our Canada and Mexico Institutes about strengthening North American ties. We've collected essays from Canadians, Mexicans, and Americans, all saying why it's a smart thing to do to invest in North America. So please take a look. We'll look forward to getting back together with you all to continuing this discussion on what is a really important channel for doing that, USMCA's implementation. Thank you all very much. Have a very good afternoon.